Starting out here, close to where we left off last time, we are dealing with Nero, member of the notorious Julio-Claudian dynasty. And by the time we're done today, that family will be extinct. Well, one of the most notorious things that happened during Nero's reign was that disastrous and devastating fire that wiped out a huge portion of downtown Rome. After which, as we saw, he sought a scapegoat, decided to latch on to that small sect of Christians who were becoming a little more widely known outside their own group and the Jewish community. That persecution, as we saw, backfired, aroused sympathy for the victims, and people felt that a relatively small number of innocents were being sacrificed to one man's cruelty. Nero then would begin to go a little bit off the rails, or shall we say a lot off the rails. He needed money for various purposes, including rebuilding Rome, but also for his own pleasures and his own imperial lifestyle. And in order to get the money, he had recourse to a couple of expedients. For one thing, forced contributions extracted from cities in Italy, which is a little bit more extreme than the regular taxes and import fees that were often coming into the government. These are going directly to the emperor and they're extracted by force. He's seizing the estates of wealthy citizens. He's even having rich landowners killed to get his hands on their property, which is kind of like a clumsier and a much more unpredictable form of proscription process, isn't it? Plus, in order to supplement his funding, he debased the coinage, meaning he took what used to be rather pure gold or silver or sometimes bronze coinage and mixed it in with other metals of less pure, less precious value. So the coins themselves have a face value way above the intrinsic value of their metal. This, of course, can lead to inflation. And when people realize the money in their pocket is not really worth what they're expecting it to be or thought it was, that is never a very popular move. Nero's one of the first Roman leaders to go in for that on a large scale. So all these activities are damaging the economy, but even worse is the feeling that people are beginning to get that precious metals, gold and silver basically, are draining out of the empire and are going to the east, to Syria, to Arabia, India, and maybe beyond to pay for the luxury goods that the Roman Empire is now importing more and more. Adding to his unpopularity, and this is where why I say on here, acting a little bit like Claudius. Adding to his unpopularity, Nero began using more and more freedmen, like Claudius had using freedmen, educated Greeks, and people from other Eastern regions for jobs that the Senate and the Romans and sometimes the Italians believed should rightfully be reserved for them. Jobs like prefects, administrative officials essentially, and procurators, which are imperial appointees in place of, for instance, senatorial governors. The emperor is removing senators more and more from the machinery of imperial administration. People don't like this. Certainly Tacitus doesn't like it, and others who represent the senatorial point of view don't either. So things are rather restive, and this shows up in a number of ways with problems both at home in Rome and abroad. Most famously and most notoriously, a large movement that began in secret and has become known as the Pisonian conspiracy. It starts around 62 CE, and the aim is to remove Nero from power, replace him with a member of another important noble Roman family. A fellow named Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso. Calpurnii are a very revered ancient patrician family in Rome. So this is the Pisonian conspiracy. A large segment of the population, apparently, not only senators, supported this movement, including a guy named Finius Rufus, who was one of the prefects of the Praetorian Guard. And when the Praetorians begin turning against you, you know an emperor is in trouble. So Piso was apparently contemplated as a candidate for the imperial power. Other people suggest that some members of this conspiracy thought that Seneca would be a good choice. Remember, Seneca was one of Nero's advisors in the early years. He had fallen into a bit of disfavor with the emperor, but he was an experienced government official. He knew how the machinery of the imperial palace worked. He was apparently fairly Republican in his leanings and fairly patriotic. Other people say that even if Seneca had been towards the helm of this movement, he might have been just a cover for a movement to bring back the old republic, not to put Seneca or Piso or anybody in Nero's place as emperor. Well, this conspiracy, as it's known, became publicly widespread. Nero's secret police heard about it, and he and they reacted with a very, very rough crackdown, which I think you're reading about in your books of Tacitus this week. A bloody crackdown in which many prominent individuals lost their life, including Seneca himself, regardless of how close and trusted a friend and advisor he used to be. Seneca dies, so does Lucan, who was a prominent poet of this generation, and actually the poet responsible for that long epic about Caesar's civil wars. Finius Rufus, that Praetorian Guard leader, dies, leaving a fellow named Tigellinus as the sole remaining prefect of the Praetorians. And Tigellinus is much harsher and more bloodthirsty than Rufus would have been. Nero ended up using Tigellinus to hunt down more suspects. He used spies and informers to ferret out suspicious behavior everywhere. And in the end, people were having the sentiment that he had become an even worse tyrant than Gaius Caligula had been. The image on this slide is clearly a modern era painting. It depicts the death by suicide of one of the leading members of the Senate who fell victim to this reign of terror. That one is Thrasea Paetus, whose name you're now familiar with from your reading of Tacitus. And he's a member of a Stoic circle of philosophers who were among the leading thinkers of the day. They included prominent senators, even some ex-consuls like Paetus himself. Another name is Helvidius Priscus, Boreas Soranus, and others fall victim here. Not just because of random cruelty, but in a way for a good reason, because Stoic philosophy, which was seen to be an appropriate form of philosophy for Romans, this movement of thought was actually a breeding ground for Republican sentiments. And some of these people, such as Paetus, who comes across in your books of Tacitus almost as a hero of that whole section, Paetus had made a point of being pretty blunt and outspoken in criticizing the excesses of this imperial reign. They, not all of them, in fact, were involved in the conspiracy itself, but because of that outspokenness, they fell victims. It was a pretty widespread conspiracy and ended up being unsuccessful. And that's just one of the trouble signs that darkens this period of Nero's reign. Again, problems in the provinces, and this is all happening roughly around the same time. Disturbances out in the provinces and on the frontiers. One of the most famous episodes being the revolt in Britannia, in Britain, led by Boudica, the, well, I'll call her the warrior queen. Warrior queen. She was, you might call her a tribal leader. Her husband had been a noble or a royal individual among the Celtic natives in Britain. And the story was that this goes back to the year 59 CE. And Tacitus tells us that she was responding to some personal injuries that she and her family had suffered, including the seizure of large amounts of land that she owned and the rape of her daughters by members of the Roman military and the government machinery in Roman Britain. That may have been part of the motivation for this rebellion, but also there were more widespread causes. There was a lot of discontent among the natives of Britain over some extremely harsh levels of taxation that the Romans were imposing. One thing you often see when the Romans look to how to administer their empire is that they feel like the provinces that they now rule should basically run in the black or at a profit by paying for the expense of administering them, because the Romans always felt that by bringing Roman government to replace the old systems, which are usually monarchies of one kind, the Romans had benefited those provinces. Well, Britain was one place suffering from this, and the Britons were in no way used to or prepared to come up with that amount of cash money. Another factor here is forced contributions to the imperial cult. One example being the temple built in honor of the Emperor Claudius, conqueror of Britain, at a place called Camulodunum. Also, of course, the Romans thought that native religions were sometimes to be discouraged, not always completely discouraged, but for instance, Druidism, which the Romans found to be the main strain of belief in Britain. Well, Druidism, the Romans believed, was way too barbaric because they thought that it involved human sacrifice. That's kind of an open question. Whether the Druids did engage in human sacrifice on any widespread scale is kind of doubtful. But the Romans used that implication as an excuse or a pretext for harshly suppressing the Druids. So this was a fairly successful rebellion in its early stages, reflected in this romanticized image on the screen behind me of Boudica leading her rebellious warriors. But it brought very severe crackdowns from the Romans. The legions came back in force, and at Camulodunum, at London, which is the Roman capital, at Verulamium, which is farther north, 70,000 people having perished in the rebel attacks. The counteraction by the Roman legions more than equaled that. It suppressed the rebels with a major field victory, after which Boudica killed herself, and the governor, a fellow named Suetonius Paulinus, began exacting reprisals very, very harshly and firmly. After a little bit, he'd be replaced by somebody else who was a little more conciliatory. But this rebellion of the Britons and the myth of the warrior queen has found its place in the national mythology of Britain and the independent United Kingdom. They feel that this was a heroic episode in their history. I think this will be a good time to pause. We'll come back to some of the other troubles that Nero faced and see how this in the end will undo his fairly lengthy reign. See you soon.